Hi, and welcome to the lecture and slideshow for Module 10. Today I will be talking about the two other Venetian artists that we consider masters of the Renaissance, Tintoretto and Veronese. So some of the key points that I'll be talking about today are how these artists are both rivals with Titian and each other. Although Titian is quite a bit older than both Tintoretto and Veronese, and they both outlive him to a certain extent, they are working at the same time in the same place for a number of decades. They're competing for commissions, and that leads to some interesting dynamics between them and their art. Tintoretto and Veronese both work for a variety of patrons, but as you will see, there are different sorts of patrons that each works for. Between these two artists, you also have a serious contrast in pictorial approach. It would be very difficult to confuse the work of Tintoretto with that of Veronese. They both have very distinctive styles. So these are the two other really prominent painters in Venice in the 16th century. As I said, they all have different types of patrons, but one patron that they all share includes the state, the Republic of Venice itself, and sometimes they even have commissions in the exact same spaces. So I would like today to begin with the artist Tintoretto, and we'll look at a number of his works before moving on to the work of Veronese. Tintoretto was born in Venice in 1518. His father was a dyer, hence his nickname. So his real name is Jacopo Robusti, but he gets the name Tintoretto, which means little dyer, because of his father's profession. According to legend, he was initially apprenticed to Titian, but it was said that Titian became jealous of Tintoretto's skill and sent him away. Another important thing to know about Tintoretto is that it was said that over his studio door he kept an inscription in Italian that translated to Michelangelo's design and Titian's color. So that should tell you immediately the kind of work he was aiming to produce. So one of the major sites where Tintoretto executes a huge number of paintings is in the Sala Grande di San Rocco in Venice. And I've talked a bit about the Sala Grande. Remember, these are these important confraternity-like places. And in the 15th and 16th century, we see them decorating their meeting rooms pretty considerably. And Tintoretto ends up working at the Sala Grande di San Rocco for a considerable amount of time. He works for a few of them for a few other scuole as well, but his complete decoration of the Sala Grande di San Rocco makes it something of a master work of his. So pretty much every single painting you can see in this image is done by Tintoretto. Originally, he was in competition with other artists for the commission, and this is something that Vasari relates in the reading that you had to do for today, but he managed to trick his way into winning it. So here is the work in question. Each of the artists who wanted to enter the competition were ordered to execute a depiction of San Rocco, Saint Roche, for the ceiling. So this is the patron saint of the scuola, and so they each needed to execute one, and they would then be judged, and whoever won would get the overall commission for the entire decoration. The way he ended up winning this was he went and installed this painting in the ceiling of the chamber that it was intended for. And this is a small room off that large room I was just showing you. By installing it ahead of time, this constituted a gift to the scuola, and they weren't allowed to reject gifts. And so he got the rest of the commissions for doing that, and he never got paid for this one in particular, but I don't think that really matters since he was able to complete the entire cycle of paintings. In the same room as the painting I was just showing you, the large wall is occupied by this massive scene of the Crucifixion by Tintoretto. It is just huge. It takes up an entire wall, and I think a reproduction doesn't really give it a sense of how dynamic it is in the space. Actually, that's true of almost all of Tintoretto's works. Before I went to Venice and saw his works in person, they really confused me. They didn't seem to make a lot of sense. They seemed really dramatic and complicated, but his works on site are just incredible. He's always thinking about how the viewer is going to be seeing this painting. So I would judge that this work is almost 15 feet long and something like 7 feet high. I'm just kind of guessing here, but it's massive. It sort of is organized into three parts. In the center, you have the crucified Christ dominating the vertical axis and also the topmost part of this canvas. And then on either side, you have two distinct zones. You see some significant diagonals created for the two crosses of the thieves that are both in the process of being raised. So on the left side, you see this really dramatic diagonal. It's not that sharp of a diagonal per se, but the fact that it recedes backwards into space, giving a really good sense of how deep this landscape scene is supposed to go. He's in the process of being raised up next to Christ. And then in the background on the right side, you see the other thief who is still in the process of being nailed to this cross and will eventually be set up on the right side of Christ. On the far right and the far left side of this painting, you see several figures on horseback, and these figures include several portraits of members of the Scuola who are there as witnesses to the crucifixion. This is a really good example of Tintoretto's interest in dynamic compositions and his energetic brushstroke. He charged his narratives with a never-before-seen energy. Another characteristic of his paintings is you often have these really incredible sources of light. They have a sort of mystical quality to them. So if you look at the figure of Christ, he's got this huge aura surrounding his torso and his arms. This light just emanates from him because he is this holy figure, and it seems to light a good deal of the space around him. Now, another very common quality of Tintoretto's works is that it seems very sculptural. And that is because we know from the primary sources, from biographies, how he worked. We know a bit about his working method. He would study for his compositions in his studio by posing wax or clay models that he would hang in a theater-like setting in his studio. And then he would shine lights on them in different ways. And I think you get a really good sense of that in all of his works, the fact that he's thinking about three-dimensional forms as they are articulated by a light source. This lends a very sculptural feel to his figural style. Tintoretto also is known to have worked very, very quickly, and as I talked about with Titian's later work, he uses a very loose brush stroke. And unless I'm showing you details of his painting, sometimes that's kind of hard to see, although perhaps you can get a sense of it in this crucifixion scene, in the streaks of the sky in the background, or in the drapery of the figures who are all gathered at the base of the cross here. Another work that he does for the Scuola di San Rocco, and this is actually in a lower floor room, so I showed you the large meeting hall. This is in the room directly below that on the lower story. We see him executing an Annunciation, and this is a very common scene in Venice, in central Italy. We've seen several examples of this, but it's really conceived in a new way in the work of Tintoretto. Now, if we were in a classroom setting, I would ask you to compare this work with the dynamism that you saw in the previous work, the Crucifixion, but I'll just go through a couple of the salient points here. So on the right side, you see the seated figure of the Virgin Mary. She is sitting with a book in her lap at this desk. In the background, you see this beautiful bed, and there are many features of it that look like she's in a Venetian palazzo, the decoration of the ceiling, the beautiful fabrics and curtains of the bed. But then there's other elements that show the significant dilapidation, even in her room, but also especially of the exterior. So you see this chair with the caning of the seat starting to fall apart in her room. And then if you look at the architecture here, you got this combination of marble or stone elements with brick, and it's just all falling apart. The angel Gabriel rushes in through this doorway, and the stream of angels follows him and also follows the Holy Spirit, which in this case is emanating this divine light, as is this sort of halo around the head of the Virgin Mary. And then on the left side of the painting, you've got just this collection of, it's like a wood shop basically. It should sort of remind you of the fact that Joseph was a carpenter, but it's this really dynamic and active composition showing Tintoretto's interest in perspective, in light, and look at the garments of the angel Gabriel, and you can see those quick brush strokes, not really blended. The highlights just sit on the surface of the painting. Just to remind you of something we saw earlier, on the left side here is Fra Angelico's Annunciation. Now we're at a significant remove in time and location between these two works. Remember, Fra Angelico is working in the middle of the 15th century. Tintoretto is working here in the middle of the 16th century, and the Venetian tradition is quite different than the Florentine. But I think that if you start looking at these, you can see the difference in the careful organization of space that we saw with Fra Angelico. Now, both artists are using perspectival techniques, but they're quite different in their depth. Tintoretto's recedes very quickly upwards so that the vanishing point is very near to the angel Gabriel, so you know exactly where you should be looking here. The composure of the Virgin Mary is incredibly divergent between the two figures here. The Virgin Mary in Tintoretto's acts with a good amount of surprise as she sort of turns away from the Virgin Mary, whereas Fra Angelico's bows towards him with her arms crossed in this very pious posture. Fra Angelico's is very still with only these two figures in this almost cold architectural setting, whereas Tintoretto's is dramatically different with the rushing of angels. You get a very good sense of the movement of this burst of activity that's taking place inside the bedroom of the Virgin Mary, this very stark contrast of a space compared with the outside world. So just some things to be thinking about when we're looking at important Renaissance paintings that are separated pretty considerably by time and location. Another work that Tintoretto completes for the Sala Grande di San Rocco, and this is actually on the ceiling of that first room that I showed you, the Sala Grande, where they would have their major meetings. And in this room, the Sala Grande, we see the scenes chosen very carefully, emphasizing the charitable aims of the scuola. There's a lot of active participation from members in the governing of these confraternities. Members weren't eligible to be in the great council of the city because they weren't of the noble classes. Venice has a very strict system of nobility and different levels of society, and only members of the nobility could be included in government councils. But we see members of lower classes able to be active in these scuolae, in these confraternities. This scene here, where we see Moses drawing water from the rock, is related to the brothers' charitable acts of giving food and drink to the poor. We see Moses standing at the very center. His staff has just struck the water to the left. You can see in his right hand on his left side here, this rod in his hand where he's just struck this rock, and the water emerges, rushing out of this rock. And below, you see all these different streams of water caught by the Israelites in the wilderness. And this was the saving water, that they didn't have any food or water in the desert. And by Moses' miracle, they were able to be saved. We see in the upper right, God swooping into the scene on an orb and a cloud. So he sort of floats in this orb amidst a burst of clouds. Again, look at those brush strokes of the clouds emanating from the face of God. It's really interesting, I think, how we can't even see the full face of God here, because he is the one providing, but the miracle comes from Moses. And so you see these two very important figures juxtaposed, but look at how large God is in comparison. The water, the cloud, and the orb all have these sort of ghostly outlines, which is a very common feature in Tintoretto's works. Look at the background figures as well. So the figures in the foreground are fairly well defined, I mean, with quick brush strokes. They have a sense of mass, but it's a bit looser than in the work of somebody like Michelangelo. But look in the background. In order to show these figures as far away, they're also shown with these sort of ghostly outlines. They don't have a great saturation of color here. It indicates that they are further back in space, and this is another common element used in the work of Tintoretto. Some concessions have been made in this work due to the fact that the viewer sees this from below. So there's a sharp incline that the Israelites are seated on. Look at the way that we see Moses as if largely from below. It almost seems like the figure should slide out of the painting because that incline is so sharp. Tintoretto uses contrasts in dark color with very bright highlights. More contrasts include dramatic gestures and movements in the paintings, which provides an energetic attitude for the painting as a whole. There's a lot of activity going on here. You can get a sense of movement of the Israelites and the activity of the water streaming, gushing out of the rock. And I think that's largely due to his technique. His quick brushstrokes lend it a spontaneous quality, and his works really are never static. Tintoretto also completes a number of paintings for a church in the northern part of the city called the Madonna del Otto. And this was actually Tintoretto's parish church. And what that means is he lived in the neighborhood. This is the church he attended regularly, and it's where he and many members of his family are buried today. He started painting in this church around the year 1546, and he was said to have done these two large paintings for no fee in order to help his work become better known. So another strategy like at the Sala Grande di San Rocco. These two works are massive. They are about 15 meters high each, so just incredibly massive paintings. And they are on either side of the apse of the church. So these are on the right wall and the left wall, just as the church changes into the apse, so just immediately separating the sacred space from where the normal viewer would be. I want to start with the image on the right. What we're seeing here is the story of the worship of the golden calf. Vertical formats can often be difficult to deal with, especially something on this monumental scale, but Tintoretto is able to exploit this format amazingly well. This is the story from the book of Exodus where Moses goes up on the mountain to talk to God, essentially, and it's at this time that he receives the tablets of the law. So you see the vertical element of the mountain here, this large cliffside, bathed in heavenly light, emanating a heavenly light is Moses, bare-chested, sort of communing with the heavens at this point. And you see this swirl of angels, this sort of cyclone of angels who are coming down to greet him, emerging from the dark clouds of heaven, carrying the tablets of the law that Moses would then go down and give to the Israelites. Well, while Moses was gone, they disregarded his commands that they wait for him and to never worship any false idols. And we see this group of Israelites gathered down below, and in the center here, we see that they've created this large golden idol, a golden calf that they're now processing through their camp and actively worshiping. In many ways, this work should remind you of something like Raphael's Transfiguration. Now, even though we're working on a much larger scale here with Tintoretto's work, you can see a very different conception between the upper register and the lower register. The light system is different. The delineation of figures is quite different. We see that desaturation with Moses again, like we saw with the Moses striking water from the rock from the Sala Grande di San Rocco, whereas the figures down below, who occupy similar space as the viewer standing here, they are much more clearly defined. They're much less quickly drawn in. Again, Tintoretto is using these massive sculptural figures, and especially with Moses, this figure of Moses, I think you can get a sense of his posing of these wax models in a theater of light. Now, about 15 years later, he does this pendant painting of the Last Judgment, which I'm showing you here on the left side. It's important to know that Tintoretto would have known Michelangelo's version of this scene probably from prints, because that work becomes extremely famous very, very quickly. That's done about 15 years before Tintoretto's Last Judgment. This actually measures about the same height as Michelangelo's Last Judgment, although it is much more narrow. In this conception of the Last Judgment, we see Christ seated at the very top. You see these circles of blue and yellow indicating the heavenly firmament. To Christ's right side, on the viewer's left, you see the Virgin Mary sort of floating in here. And on his other side, you see John the Baptist. Seated below him on this ring of clouds are the elect, several saints and the apostles who are petitioning him to save them at this moment of the Last Judgment. And then you see this swirling of figures down below this ring of clouds. Some are rushing upwards, indicated as being saved at this moment of the Last Judgment, while others are sinking and entering what is almost can be described as a maelstrom, this sort of chaotic storm that is representing hell down here at the lower right. You see this incredible contrast of light, especially in the heavenly realm, versus what's going on down in the realm representing hell down here. It almost resembles a flood and just pure chaos. Like all of these figures, especially this area of hell, is going to come spilling out of the painting towards the viewer. So it's these really drastically different conceptions, these pendant paintings that are identical in format and size, these two distinct moments of punishment, or what will lead to punishment in the case of the golden calf, in this church. They're just really incredible paintings. Again, seeing them in person is dramatically different than seeing reproductions. Also in the Madonna del Otto, Tintoretto paints a number of altarpieces, as well as this painting, the presentation of the Virgin. Now this was originally two vertical halves, now stitched together down the center, because originally they were decorating the organ shutters. Now it's been stitched together and is hung over the door leading to the sacristy in this church. But paintings of organ shutters were actually pretty common in Renaissance Venice. The story of the presentation of the Virgin is that when she was just a tiny child, she was able to climb the steps of the temple when her parents took her there, and she managed to miraculously climb them on her own to go reach the high priests at the top of the steps. Now here in Tintoretto's painting, he's had these stairs, these 15 steps leading up from the ground all the way up to the temple as the dominant aspect of his painting. There's huge emphasis on the stairs. They occupy well over half of this painting, along with the figures draped across them. And the selection of 15 stairs is very particular because it's referring to the number of psalms that pilgrims would sing at annual temple processions. He uses a substantial amount of gold leaf to pick out this beautiful decoration of the stairs to further emphasize them. There's also gold leaf used to pick out the balustrade here, as well as in the garments of the high priest. Again, you've got this sort of mystical illumination going on. You can see the loose brushwork in the sky. You see the Virgin Mary rising here almost at her destination. She's emanating light herself. And then you've got this strong light cast on these figures down below who help us know where exactly we're supposed to be looking here, pointing towards her. And then the left side is cast in this really dark shadow, although certain elements do emerge through the picking out of details through this light source. Again, we've got this very sculptural effect, and I think in this work you can see his interest in disegno, in drawing and design, but the color system is so purely Venetian. Now I want to show you an example of the same subject by Titian that he executed a number of years before for another one of the scuole in Venice. Tintoretto surely would have known this work in executing his own painting. So like Tintoretto, Titian emphasizes the stairs leading up to the temple. You see light also emanating from the little Virgin Mary here. She's so sweet as she climbs up these steps to the high priests. Notice the combination of classicizing architecture and then some buildings here in the background that look rather Venetian. So this was another very large-scale painting, but I think you can see the drastic differences in the work of Titian with that of Tintoretto. You can see the interest in illusionistic effects through color, but Tintoretto is much more interested in qualities of light, especially with a sharper contrast of darkness, as well as in creating more sculptural forms. Titian, at this point in his career, has no loose brushwork at all. Everything is seamlessly blended, and that's very characteristic of this phase of his work in Venice. Now, I want to talk about one more work by Tintoretto before we move on to Veronese, and that is a work that he executes for the Great Council Hall of the Doge's Palace in Venice. So at several points in the Renaissance, the Doge's Palace catches on fire, and there's significant fires in 1574 and 1577 that led to significant renovations of the whole palace. Before the frescoes that are there today, and I'll show you this room in just a minute, there was a fresco by a famous Venetian artist named Guariento of the Coronation of the Virgin. Now I'm showing you the remains of this, so it was largely damaged in the fire, as you can see, but they were able to save some elements. And the reason I'm showing this to you is because this format, this conception of Christ and the Virgin seated on this large architectural throne, within which are all these prophets and fathers of the church attending it, this becomes a very standard type in Venetian painting. So here I'm showing you another work by Jacobello del Fiore of the same subject, the Coronation of the Virgin, which was considered by a lot of people to be a copy of Guarientos. Now, we might not consider it a copy per se today because there are some dramatic differences, but according to Venetians of this time period, they looked the same. It was the same conception. And I'll come back to this idea in just a minute, but now I want to preface Tintoretto's work just a little bit more. Here is the large painting, oil on canvas painting that Tintoretto commissions to cover over this Guariento fresco in the great council hall of the Doge's palace. So as I said, in 1577, it was irreparably damaged. The fragments of the painting were taken off the wall as well as they could be and put into another room. So after this fire, they needed a new decoration. So they decided to glorify the city itself in the Sala Grande, so the large room, the great council hall. Throughout, the paintings depict a victorious Venice, often relating to military combat or other celebrations of their government, and they showed their equivalency to other major powers. Tintoretto's painting that I'm showing you here, now called the Paradise, dominates the room. Originally, this was a commission given to Veronese, who we will discuss next, but he died before the work was even begun, so Tintoretto took over this commission. Tintoretto's work does have some relationship to Guariento's composition. It's about paradise. It's about this heavenly realm with Christ and the Virgin Mary gathered at the top. You can see them supported by this ring of angels. And although now they're not in this architectural throne, they're still surrounded by all of these figures below, looking up at them, attending this heavenly event. And as I said, Venetians of this time period considered something like this a copy of Guariento's work, even though we see it as so different. But the 16th century viewer would have emphasized the connections between the works rather than the differences. In Tintoretto's conception, you see Christ and the Virgin are dressed very similarly. They're wearing the same colors. You see that they both have this burst of light from their heads, but notice that Christ is given superiority over the Virgin. He rises up above her. The emanation of light from his head is much more dramatic. And it's very reminiscent of a Last Judgment scene with all of the swirling figures, the massive collection of people in this heavenly realm. And this is relevant to the importance of the work in the Great Council Hall. So the wall that this is on would have served as the backdrop for the council, for the primary council of Venice. They would have been seated here in this wooden seating area that you can see down below it. The paintings in this room create an epic feeling to the already grand room. I mean, it is just huge. This room is massive. And there's a really interesting contrast between the interiors and exteriors of the Doge's palace. From the outside, it looks like it's this beautiful pink and white building that looks like it's floating on the water, whereas the interior is dominated by these really strong, dramatic paintings. Okay, so now I want to move on to the work of Paolo Veronese. And just to give a little background on him before I start talking about his work in the same room, he was the son of a stone cutter from Verona, hence his nickname Veronese, that means from Verona. He was apprenticed to two local painters. Veronese's work is characterized by his radiant palette, his color palette, and aristocratic patronage. He receives his first state commissions in Venice in the 1550s. His works are characterized as crowded paintings of figures with theatrical effects and sumptuously dressed figures. So this work I'm showing you here, the Apotheosis of Venice, dates to about 1585, and this is on the ceiling of the same room of Tintoretto's Paradise. So if I go back here, if you're standing in the middle of this room looking towards the Tintoretto, if you look straight up, you're looking up at Veronese's Apotheosis of Venice. So what we have here is a secular glorification of the city. So an apotheosis is the ascent into heaven, the creation of a figure into a god. And that's exactly what we see going on here. So we see this personification of Venice, garbed in this beautiful costume. She's seated in this aura of clouds between the two towers related to the architecture of the Arsenale in Venice. And the Arsenale was where they built all of their ships. So it's significant because, remember, Venice is this major naval power. We see Venice being crowned by a flying victory figure, and another victory flies up above, almost out of the painting, getting ready to blow into these trumpets. Below Venice, we see personifications of peace, abundance, fame, happiness, honor, security, and freedom. So those are these figures gathered on this cloud, and those are the ideals that Venice wanted to promote about itself. We see down below this Venetian citizens dressed in contemporary clothing, standing or sitting on the balcony observing the scene. We have the Lion of St. Mark very clearly identified here. Remember, St. Mark is the patron saint of the city. And then down below at the very bottom, you see these two men on horseback, and the horses are supposed to represent this military might. So this is painted with some illusionistic effect because we would be seeing this from below, and you really get a sense of that with the way these figures sort of let you enter into the painting, and we're seeing all of the architecture and the figures from below, which makes perfect sense for a ceiling painting. It's a very dramatic political allegory, and it's an exciting reminder to the people in the room what they were working towards with their acts of governance. Again, it's composed with the idea that we're seeing this from below, and so it's almost as if we're a part of that group surrounding the architecture just on the lower level. In this work, we see a dynamism in lighting effects and dramatic foreshortening. So Veronese was a very skilled painter. So Veronese also worked for ecclesiastical patrons during his career. And here I'm showing you his very famous work called Christ in the House of Levi, which was originally painted for the refectory of Santi Giovanni e Paolo in Venice. And the refectory, remember, we've talked about this with Leonardo's Last Supper, that's like the dining hall of the monks. Veronese is known for monumental paintings that feature almost always classicizing architecture. So it's very reminiscent of the architecture being built in Venice and the area at this time with the works of architects like Palladio and Jacopo Sansovino. Throughout, we see Veronese using jewel-like tones. And he does several of these types of paintings showing feasting scenes for monastic refectories. So this is the work that you're reading about Veronese was talking about, where he had to appear before the Inquisition. So after the Council of Trent, when the Catholic Church decides to have some internal reforms, the Roman Inquisition was established, and some popes were more zealous about this than others. They wanted to expunge religious images of any lasciviousness. Some art and artists came under attack, and Veronese's appearance before the Inquisition for this work is probably the most famous example of that. And the transcript survives of his appearance, which is what you read for this module. In the text of the Inquisition, the inquisitors ask him whether he was commissioned to paint such figures. And as you know, he defended his decisions and explains that painters, quote, take the same license the poets and the jesters take, end quote. Because originally this wasn't titled Christ in the House of Levi. Instead, this was called a Last Supper, a very typical scene in a monastic refectory. You see Christ seated at the very center at this long table that's been set up between these two arcades. You can see the recession of space here. The other apostles are there, as well as just dozens of other figures, dogs, dwarfs, and remember the Inquisition talked about German soldiers, for example. It was considered an indecorous treatment of the Last Supper. Several figures weren't included in the biblical narrative of the story, so instead of changing the painting as he was ordered to do, Veronese decided to change the title, providing a context for all of the inappropriate figures. So the feast in the House of Levi was this moment where Christ went and dined in the house of a tax collector, who later becomes one of his apostles. But the fact that tax collectors were regularly surrounded by sinners, this grouping of figures seemed appropriate. This is another massive, massive work. If you go to the Accademia in Venice, where it's now housed, it occupies an entire wall of one of the largest galleries. And I think especially with this painting, you can get a really good sense of how Veronese often composes his scenes almost like a stage set. So the figures occupy this foreground space. This looks very much like built architecture of a Roman theater and of some contemporary theaters. And then if you look in the background, see how hazy and desaturated the architecture is. It's supposed to look like receding into space, very much like a stage set, so creating almost a backdrop. Another work on a similarly monumental scale and also for a monastic refectory is this painting called The Wedding at Cana, which he did between 1562 and 1563 for the refectory at San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. This is one of Veronese's most famous paintings, and now it's found in the Louvre because when Napoleon invaded Venice, this was very high on his list to take back to the Louvre, and it has never been able to be returned. And one thing I read once is that it got damaged somehow, and so now they fear transporting it would just really ruin the painting. So now this is in the same room as the Mona Lisa, and very few people spend time looking at it. So if you go to the Louvre, make sure and have a look at this painting as well. So as I said, this is a massive painting, and the total canvas covers 70 square meters. It's just huge. The monks wanted it to be a monumental painting to take up the entire back wall of their refectory. Veronese painted it to look like an extension of the space, and this was hung about 2.5 meters off of the ground, so these figures would have looked out over the monks dining in this room at the same time. After he does this work, other monasteries wanted similar work from him. So Christ in the House of Levi, for example, is painted about a decade later, inspired by the work The Wedding at Cana. What we're seeing here is the story of Christ's first miracle, where he and his mother, he's seated at the very center, the Virgin Mary is seated at his right side. Several of his apostles are also there. They're invited to a wedding, and here we're seeing them at the feast, and at the wedding they run out of wine. And this is his first miracle where he changes the water into wine, and you can see some figures with jugs who are beginning to pour the wine into other pitchers. You see more wine being presented because Christ has made this happen. This is also an event that was seen as a precursor of the Eucharist because wine is used in the communion. So besides the Virgin Mary and some of his disciples, we see other guests at this feast, including princes, Venetian noblemen, servants, members of the populace, and several figures of Eastern origin based on their headgear is the way you can most easily identify those figures. There are no fewer than 130 figures painted here, mixing biblical figures with contemporary Venetians. Now, according to tradition and an 18th century legend, the musician group here is actually Veronese depicting himself and several other famous Venetian painters at this time. So it's said that Veronese is the figure here in white playing this viol, and also depicted here are Titian in red and Jacopo Bassano, who are all providing the musical entertainment for the feast. Again, he frames this by monumental classicizing architecture. Notice the nice symmetry across the space with the recession of this sort of temple architecture. You see these Doric columns here with these Corinthian ones contrasted in the back. Of course, there's some variation, especially with the people who are out watching the scene, all sorts of different activities taking place here. And again, this is quite similar to the architecture being produced at this time. And again, it's a very theatrical setting. We see the dining table here as the centerpiece on the foreground of the stage, and it's very much like the backdrop of a stage set. We also see him using very costly pigments in order to create very luminous colors. And look at the emphasis on the detail of the fabrics, of the draperies of these figures. There's no meticulousness spared in evoking this opulent wedding scene, and this is very typical of Veronese. Another very well-known work by Veronese is this, The Family of Darius before Alexander, dating to 1565 to 1570. And what we're seeing here is a story from the Greek historian Plutarch about the aftermath of the Battle of Issus. So in 333 BC, Alexander the Great defeated Darius III, who was the last king of his empire. Darius manages to escape, but his family is captured by the victor. But the story goes that Alexander decided to treat them with dignity rather than doing anything inappropriate with Darius's mother, wife, and 2 daughters who are presented here. This scene focuses on a misunderstanding that actually isn't mentioned in Plutarch, but is mentioned in the works of a couple of other classical writers, where Darius's mother, the older woman shown here, she's shown in a bit Her clothing's a bit more drab than her daughter-in-law's, for example. When Alexander and his friend Hephaestion went to visit the women in their tent, she confused Hephaestion with Alexander. She thought that he was the great general and pleaded with Hephaestion for mercy for these women. In the end, Alexander forgave her, and her embarrassment was erased because Alexander made himself equivalent with Hephaestion. Typically, people interpret the figure in red, the more splendidly dressed military figure here, as Alexander gesturing to Hephaestion, but there are some who think the roles are in fact the opposite, that maybe he's gesturing to say, no, 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 you're wrong. I am not Alexander. It's actually this figure here. Veronese did take some liberties with this narrative because, as I said, this was supposed to have taken place in the tent of these women. Instead, this is in this palatial hall, and the women are clothed as contemporary Venetians. The men are a little bit more generic in this military garb, but the women are very distinctly in Venetian costume. These may include portraits of the Pisani family, whom the painting was done for. Another interpretation is that they're actually representing Veronese's family, and that the man, this courtier who's presenting the women to Alexander the Great, is a self-portrait of Veronese. Other interpretations say that it's a portrait of Francesco Pisani presenting his family, and that Veronese is this man shown right next to Alexander. Again, I'm emphasizing the theatrical setting of Veronese's work. The classicizing architecture acts as a screen for the main events taking place in the foreground, and you see another huge cast of characters in the background observing the events. Now remember, in his Inquisition testimony, Veronese calls himself very explicitly a painter of figures. So we know that that's what he emphasized in his work. Veronese, as well as Titian and Tintoretto, also executes a number of portraits. I wanted to show you two that are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And these portraits are characterized by a similar opulence as his large-scale narrative paintings. You can see in both of these a nuanced brushstroke. I mean, if you look at the marble figurines in this portrait of Alessandro Vittoria, a contemporary Venetian sculptor, or in the Greyhound, you can see the loose brushstroke here, which seems rather influenced by the work of Tintoretto as well as Titian's later works. You can see also his interest in textures and in the effects of light across the surface. So especially in this splendid garment of this boy with a greyhound, you can see the way the light falls over the satin. You can get a sense that if you rubbed your hand over this, you would feel the texture provided by the striping effect of the entire costume that he is wearing. We see two very different types of portraits, a full-length standing figure and then a half-length figure of a man, of Alessandro Vittorio, in front of this table covered by an Eastern carpet with very little background here. But they both have different attributes of the sitter. That's always an important element of portraiture. And you can tell the interests and the status of both figures in the way Veronese has depicted them. And now I'm going to end with two images from a single villa that is frescoed by Veronese in the early 1560s. So he does all of the wall paintings that you can see here. He doesn't just do canvas paintings. He also is happy to work in fresco. Now, fresco is not used very often in Venice because of the climate. It's very damp there and things don't dry very well. So oil would dry a lot better than a wet wall. But he is able to work in fresco, as we can see in the Villa Barbaro at Mazere. These works were for a Venetian noble family, painted in their villa, which was a little bit outside of Venice on the terra firma, the mainland holdings of Venice. And this villa was designed by the great architect Andrea Palladio. So this was commissioned by these two brothers, Daniele Barbaro, who was the patriarch of Aquileia and a substantial humanist, and the other, Marcantonio, was a diplomat for the Venetian Republic. So they shared this villa. And Veronese's paintings here came to influence other villa decoration. You can see a substantial amount of fictive architecture. So you can see that the frames around this door here on the left side, and then this fake door, this trompe-l'oeil door, it's tricking you, making you think it's real. Those are actual architecture. The cornice of the room is actual architecture, but every other element you see here is painted by Veronese, and it's like his classicizing architecture in all of his previous paintings is perfectly employed here to create this illusion that this is actual architecture of this room. You also see between these fictive archways illusionistic openings into scenes of nature, and scattered throughout you have portraits of members of the family as well as the staff. You also see depictions of allegorical figures posed above renditions of what looks like ancient gemstones, over renditions of what look like ancient gems. This is all about illusionism, which is appropriate for villa decoration, very much like that of how the ancient Romans decorated their villas, especially with these landscape scenes. It's also celebrating the natural world and the virtues of the family. Now, a villa is a country house, but most of these villas, especially in northern Italy, were also working farms. So this emphasis on nature is very, very important. I also wanted to show you the ceiling of this main room. In this view, you can see a couple more portraits. So if you look on the far right side and then the far left side, you see two female figures here, a young boy here, and then across on the left side, you see two older boys here and here. Now we know that this figure dressed splendidly in blue is a portrait of Justiniana Justinian, who was the lady of the house. She's shown with a servant woman who is shown in stark contrast to her. Her clothing is very different. Her skin tone is even different. And she's probably this faithful servant, probably a nursemaid based on her clothing. And then the youngest Barbaro boy seems to be the one depicted here, who is looking at this parrot shown here. And then on the other side, you have two older Barbaro boys who are also playing with birds. And you see this monkey depicted here. So they're surrounded by their pets. Now on the ceiling itself, we see Veronese painting this illusionistic opening up of the ceiling. Seated in the very center, you see this octagonal, very classicizing fictive architecture here. Right in the center, this woman in white, who is seated on the back of a beast, is meant to be the personification of divine love. She sits on this beast, which represents the conquering of strife. And now we see her gesturing outwards, especially to these figures down below and also to any viewer standing down below, because she's imposing order on the universe. Below her are personifications of the signs of the zodiac, so that's how she's starting to order the universe. And then in the four corners of this architectural setting, seated on clouds, you have four gods. You have Vulcan, Cybele, Neptune, and Juno. And these are alluding to the four elements of fire, earth, water, and air. In between the gods here, you've got these paintings that are meant to look like, again, gemstones or sculpture. And those are showing reclining gods associated with the four seasons. And this was a very popular sort of interior decoration. It's especially appropriate for a villa, even though one of these patrons is a patriarch, he's a major religious figure. It's still okay to show these pagan images in your country home. Villas are sort of pleasure retreats in a lot of ways, and Veronese's work is perfect for a setting like this. Remember his theatrical take on things, his opulence, his emphasis on fabrics. He was very, very popular with the nobility. So I will end the lecture there today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned a great deal about Tintoretto and Veronese. Thank you.